All right. Hello. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for making it out for this. We know it's been a long day, so we appreciate all the troopers who are still here. Hey, so my name is Rob Gorelnik. I'm a curator at the Florida Museum of Natural History. My work there is in biodiversity informatics, and more these days, it's also in the realm of machine learning and AI. But I'm more of the MC for our session today. I'll be here to help coordinate activities. I'm really excited to be able to welcome these wonderful people who will be talking about how we're thinking about AI in the cultural and natural heritage space. And so what I think I want to start with is just a framing question for what we're up to here, which is how do we marry the power of AI to the world's best curated digital and physical objects and the deep knowledge about those objects that relate to cultural and natural heritage. And so the goals here are to really provide a framework for exciting work that leverages the power of AI with this incredible set of resources that we have available. We have 3 short talks, starting with Arthur Porto, who is a newly hired biodiversity AI curator. We have Nick Gauthier, also recently to the museum, who will focus on cultural heritage AI. And we also have a final presentation from Jacob Idec, who will be talking about AI as it relates to field images. We'll hopefully have about 20 minutes at the end of the session for some questions and discussion. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to them. We'll have about 10 to 12 minutes per speaker, and then at the end we'll have some guiding questions. Okay? So let's get this rolling. Come on up, Arthur, and take it away.
Thanks, Rob. So since I was the first to give a talk, I thought I would start by basically talking a little bit like why would a natural history collection would want AI. So this talk was kind of organized into 3 parts. So first I'm going to start making a pitch for why we need AI in biodiversity research. And then I'm going to spend some time giving some examples of like areas where AI is actually making a headway. And finally, hopefully I will conclude the talk, just kind of give you a little bit of like what the big challenges going forward for the application of AI will be. So to understand why AI is important for natural history collections, we really need to think about the issue of scale, right? What's the size of those collections? So I brought a recent report that was basically a survey that was made in the 7 biggest natural history museums in the world. And the question that they asked was very simple. It's just, what's the size of your collection of objects? And the number that came back from that is basically around 1.2 billion objects. So that's what we have. That's the physical basis of our understanding of the natural world. And as you can see, that's a huge number. But of course, in museum research, that's not the only thing we have. So nowadays, museums have diversified much more broadly than being a repository for objects. So for example, on the biodiversity side of things, now most museums will have genomic resources. And that's an area that presents its own challenges. So just to give you a glimpse of the scale of the problem of genomic resources, currently it's estimated in like 3 to 5 years, the average storage requirement for genomic resources in biology will outpace the ones of astronomy. So that just gives you a general idea of the scale of the problem. And of course, we have specimens nowadays, but we also have a lot of information on them. We have media files associated with them, so we have pictures, we have videos, in some cases we have audio. So this is a problem that is growing and growing and growing, and the amount of information we have is growing and growing, and that's very exciting, but it is also challenging, especially when we consider whether the infrastructure of natural history museums is keeping up with the pace of development. When we look at most natural history museums, the situation is very different. So most museums are severely understaffed, which generates then backlogs in the processing of materials, and make it so also that the majority of that data is not discoverable over the internet. So that presents a problem, because if we are the repository or that physical basis of our understanding of the natural world, how can we do any informed decision on it if we can't even get through it, like know what we have? So in other words, my pitch for AI is pretty simple. It's like, why do we need AI? We need AI because when we look at those numbers, when we look at 1.2 billion objects, 131 million specimen records, or 2.5 billion occurrence records, at that kind of scale, the only thing that can scale to that point is AI and machine learning. Like, manual processing of data will never get us to be able to deal with that effectively. So that was my short pitch for AI. So that's why I think we need AI in biodiversity. And what are we seeing in terms of, so now moving on to the section of examples of that, what are we actually seeing, or areas where AI is making headways into that? So one of the things that is very exciting that is happening is AI is making headways into digitization and cataloging of materials in museum collections. So traditionally, those are tasks that are basically done by manual sorting and cataloging, documentation. You go to the literature, you study your organisms, and then you kind of try to process that data. But now we're seeing AI make headways into that. So an obvious example is, for example, in the Smithsonian, they have automated digitization of herbarium sheets. And that's pretty straightforward. So it's basically a conveyor belt where you put herbarium sheets, and then there's an object detector and then imaging equipment that automatically takes picture and catalogs that information. But perhaps I think the example that I think is most exciting, it's things like the biodiscovery machine that you see on the right. It's a university in Denmark, and the idea is quite simple. So they collect bulk insect samples, and as you may know, insects are one of the most diverse groups of organisms in the world. So how do you process and catalogs that effectively? So the machine is based on the idea that there's a mechanical arm. That mechanical arm goes to the bulk sample, collects individual insects from the bulk sample, drops them into that box-like structure that you see on the top. So they fall down a tube at a first stage, and as the sample falls down that tube is filled with ethanol, and so the sample slowly drifts down to the bottom of the machine, and as it drifts down, high-speed cameras take a bunch of pictures of that specimen and kind of store that information associated with the specimen data. And then once that happens, then the specimen falls one more level down to a cuvette and gets placed, a label is printed, the specimen is sorted, there's an automated classification algorithm that kind of makes a good guess of what group that insect belongs to. So that's one of the areas where I think digitization is starting to make headways that can have a very compelling effect in natural history research. So the other area where we see a lot of development is on the data enrichment side of things. So as you may know, like, we've been collecting living organisms for a long time, and nowadays a lot of that data is already in formats where a computer could make use of it, but for a long time it wasn't. And so we have a lot of information on specimens that are not properly cataloged or digitized. So there's been a lot of efforts as well in terms of automating that process, digitization of that metadata, and that provides us then with some kind of data enrichment that we wouldn't have otherwise. So there are projects like Lightning Bug, where essentially they get a specimen. Let's say you have an insect that is pinned, that they have a series of cameras take a picture of that insect and that label, and that images of those labels get composited in 3D, and then they get that 3D composite image, and then they have an OCR system to read that label, and that information then gets parsed into a machine-readable format. So again, another area where AI is like really helping us deal with the complexities of that kind of work environment. One that is very exciting, and perhaps the one where that makes the most headway into general population, is the search and retrieval side of things. I think most of you have had some experience with an app where you can take a picture of something that you see in your garden, and then it gives you a prediction for what that is. And that's another area where AI is really making headways. So traditionally, whenever you had a picture of an organism, you want to know what it was. If you didn't know anything about it, and if you were not a taxonomist of the group that it happened to take a picture of, you would have to do some kind of keyword search and maybe look at some field guide and try to make sense of it. But nowadays, we have both semantic and image-based search algorithms and can also do classification, so things like iNaturalist. And those things really speed up that process. Nowadays, you can use an image as a way to search for things. And perhaps the area where I think AI has made the most headway is the part of analysis and insights. So nowadays, we have very good algorithms that basically get specimen data and the image data associated with them and extract from that image a lot of information about things. So these can be like segmentations where you describe at a pixel level which object that belongs to and what kind of size of that object and all kind of morphometrics on top of that. You have automatic placement of landmark and anatomical landmarks on things of more biomedical nature, for example. And you have even like you can parse color, compare color across individuals of different species and kind of try to understand color changes and color evolution. So this area of analysis and insights is by far the one where I think AI has made the most headway. But that's not to say that there's not important challenges, and I think it's important to recognize them. So perhaps one of the biggest challenges of dealing with natural world is the fact that it shows this kind of distribution that you see on that plot. So that's just a plot of GBIF data records for the last 3 years. And it's a plot of the number of observations for each species plotted against the number of species on the x-axis. And what you can see is that it has that kind of long tail. So that's considered a long tail problem, which is basically described as the fact that for certain species, we have a lot of information. So when you look at the first species on that plot, sometimes for a single species, you can have 6 million images and a lot of information about them. That's fine, and that's great. But when we look at the rest, for the vast majority of species, we have very little to no information at all. Considering that we have millions and millions of species, and you see like the plot only goes to 300,000, you see that the problem becomes, for the vast majority of species that we have in the world, we have no information at all. So how do you deal with that? How do you do an image classification algorithm, for example, that tries to classify things at species level, if for the majority of species you have no image at all? And that's an important challenge going forward. Another important challenge is that data is biased in many ways, and one obvious source of bias is geographic distribution. So we know that biodiversity patterns around the world are distributed according to what you see on the left, where most of the biodiversity is concentrated in the tropics, at least if we think of biodiversity in terms of species richness. But when you actually look at occurrence data and you compare that map with the map of biodiversity, you see that actually the majority of our observations and occurrences for natural history data actually comes from the global north. So there's almost a negative correlation between the places that have the most biodiversity and the amount of occurrence data that we have on the thing. So the most biodiversity places on Earth are the ones with least amount of observations, and the least biodiverse places in the world are the ones with the most amount of observations. So that all translates down and becomes an important challenge when dealing with machine learning. So to conclude, I wanted to, in this talk, just to emphasize that the integration of AI is really going to be essential for biodiversity research. And they will really help us make more informed decisions about the natural world. But to do that, there are very non-trivial problems ahead of us, and it will be interesting to see how this all play out. And without further ado, I want to call Nick, and he'll talk more about the human side of things.
All right. Hi, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about the Earth system. What is the Earth system? The Earth system is what we refer to as the sum total of our planet. So the atmosphere, the oceans, the biosphere, and all the interactions between them. And when researchers think about the Earth system, we usually leave out one really important part of it, which is people. So not just ourselves, but also the built environment around us, the physical remains of what we do on the planet, has actually been the predominant driver of change on the planet for a very long time. So not just today when you can look at the Earth from space and see these physical manifestations of humans, but also from the distant past. And now we know for a fact that humans have been transforming Earth's surface for thousands of years. If you plot out the lifetimes of major cities and historical cultures, we see here down there in the bottom is New York. That's like the really tiny line at the corner. Up here we have cities like Athens and Rome and other places you may never have heard of, like Uruk, that have lasted for literal thousands of years. And so when we think about understanding our society and how we interact with the climate and environment around us, just focusing on the narrow sliver of the last 20, 50 years loses us this breadth and depth of information that's out there waiting for us. And so the goal of what I do is trying to reconstruct these patterns, to map out changes both in climate and in human history across the last 12,000 years. So basically the beginning of the current climate period that is currently coming to an end. And the key to all this is natural history collections, because in many cases, these are the only observations we have of how these processes have changed in the past. So you can go count the rings on a tree ring, or on a tree, and reconstruct the annual changes in rainfall for a given place. Or you can look at, microscopically the remains of pieces of pottery or other artifacts and use the minerals inside of them to trace out networks of trade and migration. And so these kinds of collections are crucial for answering present day questions of how our society actually adapts to climate change. So the way we do that at the Florida Museum is 3 main tracks. So one is direct analysis of artifacts themselves. The second is by looking at the environmental and climate context around those artifacts. And third, by putting them all together in dynamic simulations that we can actually use to reconstruct change over time. So first, the most direct application is doing machine learning directly on archaeological data. This is a dangerous GIF. You can look at this for a long time, and it'll just keep going. And it's just an example of all the variety of kinds of artifacts we have. This is just collections of pottery from Spain found in Florida. So this is just a narrow sliver of what we have in our collections. And even a collection like this can be really difficult for people to navigate. So one thing we're working on is using natural language processing to help us better search and access these data sets. This is something that Arthur just alluded to. But say you find a piece of pottery like this in your backyard, like you don't know that this is called Staffordshire slipware. I didn't before I went and looked this up. But you are able to look at it and understand some physical features of it. And what we want to do here is basically use AI to train a system that will allow us to search our collections for information like this. So one example of what we can do is use a system like GPT-4, feed it an image like this, and ask it to describe the image as if you were a novice, or as if you were an elementary schooler, as if you were a grad student in archaeology. And we can get, for free, these plain text examples of these descriptions. I love this one here, second from the bottom, that describes it like a marble cake. I've been looking at this picture for a while. I think it looks like a Reese's or something like that. And that's the kind of thing, like, someone who finds this wouldn't know this technical terminology. This is like dipped slipware. There's lots of French words you use to describe these patterns, but it kind of looks like a piece of cake. And by getting a bunch of these plain text descriptions, these natural language descriptions, we can then train a model to go in the reverse direction, to actually go from these natural language queries to show us what artifacts in our collections most match what it is we're looking for. So once you've actually found the data you want, we have to analyze it. And machine learning helps there too. So I mentioned before, we can take a piece of pottery from an archaeological site, we can slice into it, look at it under the microscope, and track out the individual minerals in it and where they came from in order to reconstruct trade networks. Now, typically, this is a super labor-intensive job. You have to look under a microscope and count individual grains of sand for hours. Nowadays, we can just segment the image with relatively few masks as training data and get really high-quality outputs, mapping every single grain of sand or mineral, and try to identify them, just in seconds rather than hours. So once we have all that artifact information, we also can use deep learning and generative modeling in specific to reconstruct the climate and environmental context around what we found in the collections. So for example, say we have these records of historical temperature fluctuations over Tibet, complex, hard to understand, hard to compare with records we may have from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the same region. Instead, we can process all this data and find low-dimensional, simple patterns that maximally explain the change in climate and weather over time. And so we can use those both to understand how the climate system is working in a given place, but also use it to generate new realizations of past weather and integrate those directly with museum collections like tree rings or pollen records that indirectly tell us something about what the climate was actually doing in the past. Since we have those two pieces, artifacts and environmental context, we put it together with simulation modeling, specifically agent-based modeling. So this is kind of maybe a sub-branch of AI from the 70s, maybe that's split off. But instead of thinking of one super intelligent agent, we're working with many not that intelligent agents. So simple agents with simple rules. And the idea is that we put these models together and we can run them, we can look at emergent properties of how these systems evolve over time. So you can do this kind of modeling in biology. So this is a simulation of a slime mold. I love this. You can actually use this to solve mazes. Basically, every single spore here is following a very simple algorithm for how it grows and changes, but the interaction of thousands and thousands of these spores creates this emergent whole that you would never have been able to detect just from looking at the behavior of a single spore. Turns out you can use very similar modeling approaches to look at human trade networks. For example, how our trade and migration networks might adapt to climate change in the future. The basic algorithmic principles end up being very similar. So just to finish an example of what this all looks like together, I imagine this as a digital twin of the human past. We can use our artifacts, our simulations, and our climate data to create live, updatable versions and reconstructions of change over time. So right now, I'm working on a project to do this with the Black Death in Europe and Asia, which is a global pandemic that lasted for 500 years. Not many people know that, but plague kept recurring across the world for centuries. And so we can combine direct data from outbreaks. There's a team in Switzerland that's using computer vision to look at handwritten records from medieval priests who took daily death statistics for their parishes to actually reconstruct on a large scale these changing disease patterns in the past. We can use that generative machine learning to look at major climate patterns, reconstruct historical drought events or freeze events that may have influenced the spread and transmission of disease in the past. And then we can put all those together into a dynamic simulation to actually look at the spread patterns over time and use this to understand, say, why might a disease seem to disappear for a little bit and then come back in a second wave when the climate may change in some way or when population patterns shift in an unpredictable fashion. So we can use all this information together in these simulations to reconstruct the past. We can do counterfactuals. We can say, how much worse would the plague have been if climate changed the way we expect it to over the next 100 years? So if we add 4 degrees Celsius to everything that's going on here, what might happen? And we can use these as experimental laboratories, essentially, to understand how these large-scale processes change over very long periods of time. So we're no longer just limited to, say, the 3 years of pandemic records we have from COVID. We can now look over several centuries. Okay, that's all for me. And I think Jacob's going to come next and give us a deep dive into how we actually work with data not originally from the museum, but collected from citizen scientists.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That was a good summary. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about sort of one big specific challenge in biodiversity informatics, that of extracting color traits or traits in general from iNaturalist images, and some of the challenges associated with this data. So insects have a really diverse and fabulous range of colors on their bodies. This is owing to really the diverse range of functions that these colors serve, ranging from signaling, things like camouflage, signaling to potential mates, and warnings to predators or competitors, but also physiology. Sort of potentially lesser known function of color is that where darker colors are going to absorb more heat from the sun as energy, potentially helping insects. warm up more in colder environments. So our goal really is to understand how body color has evolved, being shaped by these diverse pressures. But of course, to do that, we need data. And why might we turn to citizen science data for this kind of trait information? You guys may be aware of citizen science broadly. It's this concept where ordinary people in nature are recording image observations of things they see. And this is pretty much an image, always with a location, always with a date and a time, and often with a species ID. There are these sort of portals where experts and people on the platform are assigning IDs to these organisms. And this data can be really useful, mostly due to its scale. We have a lot of data over space. It's increasingly global and fine grain. We can maybe pick up more fine grain and global patterns. There's a lot of data over time, years, seasons, dates, and times, which may help us better understand how smaller scale changes in climate might influence these traits. There's also lots of data within species, which can be sort of a disadvantage, but it also be an advantage because we can understand intraspecific color variation, how color varies within a species. Finally, it's also a source of in-life color, right? These museum specimens, in some taxa, they can change or fade as they're held. Dragonflies, for example, their pigments sort of degrade and they fade to sort of a dull brown or black after as little as a few months or weeks. So in-life color can be really useful. Why not citizen science image data for traits? There's a lot of challenges and difficulties associated with this data. There's a lot of what I would call noise in things like the camera sensors, the lighting conditions, and the angle or view of the organism. There's no way of knowing what the sensor in the camera was that took this image or what the lighting conditions were in advance. And typically when biologists think about color data, we're really, really careful about keeping lighting and camera sensors and whatnot very standard. So we know that the data we have is comparable. But that's not the case with iNaturalist. It's also hard to come up with models and filtering approaches that are general enough to handle such diverse image data. There's all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different angles, thousands of species. It's a big challenge. So this is an overview of the approach I'm working on to try to extract dragonfly bodies and eventually dragonfly color traits from iNaturalist, the citizen science portal. So the 3 steps are segmentation, filtering, and trait extraction. And I'm going to step through these now. So for segmentation, I'm using this approach called grounded SAM, segment anything model. So this combines zero-shot, the grounding dyno, zero-shot object detector with the SAM segmentation model. These are both sort of very general pre-trained models that are intended to be effective on a really wide range of images. And it turns out they work really well in these iNaturalist insect images. So we give to grounding dyno a text prompt, something like subject, insect, or dragonfly. It draws a bounding box around what it thinks is that object, and then we give that bounding box to segment anything as a prompt to get a segmentation mask like the ones you see here. And you can probably see that it's pretty effective. However, you may have noticed that it pretty much always captures wings, which it turns out are a huge problem for dragonflies. Wings are shaded by the backgrounds behind them, making them pretty much useless for color. And they also introduce a lot of variation in the shape and size of segments, which makes handling them downstream a lot more difficult. So to deal with wings, I took sort of a brute force approach. We're just training a separate DeepLab v3 segmentation model that takes a normalized body with wings and returns one without wings. So you can see that training set on the bottom left, what we're giving the model and what we're training it to give us as output. And then on the right is sort of the whole approach, going from a start image, that grounding dyno box, the SAM segment, normalizing the SAM segment, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, but we're basically like drawing lines across the segment and then finding the one with the greatest symmetry. We're leveraging an expectation of symmetry on these wings. And I found that normalizing these and having the model expect a normalized image helped get a lot better results on removing these wings. And I think it's kind of cool because we're letting this generalized model do the heavy lifting for us by giving us bodies that we can normalize. Just wanted to briefly mention my previous approach. We tried just running that DeepLab V3 model, running it straight on the images to give us the bodies. But we got pretty poor performance with this. Very few images resulted in good segments, and many of them had poor boundaries, like the one you see on the bottom right, capturing enough of the side that it sort of is going to introduce more noise. We think this is either because the training set was too small or the model was just unable to generalize to so many different backgrounds, bodies, and images given our training set. But this new approach has upped our accuracy substantially, as we'll see. So after segmentation, we have this filtering step. I would call this sort of a human-in-the-loop kind of approach, where we are using a ResNet pre-trained on the ImageNet data set as a feature extractor to get sort of a feature vector that represents the images, represents each image. Then we're clustering those images in that feature space. And we end up with, in this case, 4 clusters. And each cluster should represent sort of a different kind of shape or view of the segments that we have. Having achieved this, we can then pick the ones we want to keep. So in this case, we see 0 has a lot of examples with just the thorax and a lot of ones that are kind of messy, so we'll discard that. We look at the example images in cluster 1, and they all look like pretty relatively good standardized bodies. Cluster 2 likewise has pretty good standardized bodies, but cluster 3 has a lot of cases with just the abdomen, which we don't want, so we'll discard that. So then we're keeping the, I think, 6,000 some images in clusters 1 and 2 here. That's that user input step, where depending on what the user wants, that's the images we keep. And this is the resulting dragonfly body segments that we get with this. In this test on the genus Aeshna, we get bodies from around 40% of the observations, which is a lot better than before. And considering the many millions of observations we have for insects, I think that's if we can apply that to a lot of different taxa, I think that's a really good number. Also wanted to briefly show it and much simpler out-of-the-box case on beetles. So we had a lot of challenges with wings. Beetles don't have wings. How much easier is this? Beetles also are kind of potentially more uniform in their shape or the angle. And it turns out beetles are really easy. This approach works with grounding dyno and segment anything, works really well out of the box on beetles. Using, once again, that segmentation and then that filter clustering method, we get these segments below, which pretty clearly contain a lot of color signal. Now, I don't have too much time to talk about this, and this is sort of where I'm at in terms of what I'm working on. But the trait extraction step, like what can we actually do with these supposedly comparable insect bodies? So on the right, I plotted the mean RGB colors of around 2,000 Aeshna individuals, and with the points highlighted by whether they're male or female. And I think it's cool that you can kind of see some signal here where females are more red and less blue. There's a lot of overlap in these point clouds, probably through a combination of real similarity and remaining noise due to things like angle, illumination, camera. But there's still some signal here, which I think is pretty cool. And on the left is sort of an example of this color clustering approach. This is sort of a way that we can sort of match up colors between different segments. Like we're trying to figure out if a blue in one image is sort of biologically equivalent to a blue in another image. And we can do that by clustering these colors to discover, for example, the amount of blue present in a dragonfly, or whether or not blue is present or absent in a dragonfly individual. So some takeaways of what I've been talking about. Citizen science images are really high volume, but come with some trade-offs that vary in how difficult they are to resolve. Some of which being frankly impossible, right? Like UV, we're simply not capturing UV frequencies in these images. So we have to think carefully about like what we might be missing with this data. But also zero-shot models can be super powerful for handling noisy images like those from citizen science.
All right. Jacob, thanks a ton for that great presentation. Nick and Arthur, that was great. I'm going to close it out here in terms of what we have to say by just trying to provide a couple of synthesis points and some points for hopefully discussion. I'll be brief. I want to turn the mic over to you guys, so I'm holding this so we can pass it around. But I think what I'd say about the presentations that we saw is that we saw some great examples that highlight the value of museums as really storehouses of these remarkably well-curated data resources, right? These are moderate volume. We're not talking about really big data, but these are moderate volume, high-quality data as opposed to just high volume, right? So these have really dense, rich data resources associated with them. You can see them from my naturalist. You can see them from Arthur and Nick's presentation. But we have really amazing associated metadata and data about these objects. And I think there's some really exciting opportunities to effectively harmonize and connect curated specimen data, and especially the burgeoning growth of field imagery coming from citizen science and community science. And that connection can be really powerful for enabling these broad looks at biodiversity and cultural diversity across landscapes. And of course, with a naturalist, you're not just looking at the observations, you're looking at the observers observing those observations, and the identifiers making those identifications of those photographs and trying to figure out what they are. I think that, when we think about the big picture here, we have these curated data sets, but they're still effectively messy. They're biased, right? They're messy in all kinds of dimensions. They're hard to connect the dots. So I think Nick was mentioning, you may have tree rings, you may have paleoclimate models, kind of putting those all into frameworks and trying to connect those. That's where I think machine learning, artificial intelligence can have some real application. And the messy data set problem is not unusual to natural history or cultural heritage data, but it might be particularly clear in the examples that we have. I think we all saw some of the importance of these foundational models, these generalized models that really help to abstract some of the problems away from the bespoke and kind of training heavy approaches we've seen in the past. We've seen this across these examples of the power of these foundational models. And especially in these messy data contexts, I think this is going to be particularly valuable and important. I think, one thing I loved about all the talks, but Arthur, I'll mention in particular your framing of this, like there are maybe more questions than answers about our future in terms of the role we play. I will say one thing, you guys, this is exciting to me, and I think it's really powerful. We are the one place in the world where we have the expertise, the talent, the resources, and the people to do the kind of new science that will happen at museums and in the context of museums more broadly in communities. To my mind, our museum is particularly powerful here at the University of Florida because we don't just connect with ourselves, we connect with hundreds of our colleagues and allied departments. I'm excited about this future, but I've got a lot of questions, and probably you do too. I'm going to leave it there and just say I'm excited to hear those questions. I don't want to do all the talking. I've got tons of questions for these guys, but I get to see them every day. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you guys. I'm going to come downstairs. Or Dave, you are.
I'll
Great.
do it for you. Yep.
Awesome. And we'll let you guys, we'll open the floor and have questions from you guys. Please, any question?
Yeah, and while you're thinking of your question, I'll put one more plug in for the museum. What Rob was saying was this blending of an incredible natural history museum with the incredible diversity of faculty and students that we have at UF. They're the fourth largest museum, natural history museum in the U.S. by numbers of specimens, and the three that are above them are standalone museums that don't have a university wrapped around them. So when we talk about that synergy, it's real in many different ways. All right, questions?
Dave, do you want to start us off?
I do. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the distribution of observational data, where of course you have lots and lots of observations of a robin and very few observations of most things, coupled with the graph that you showed of the distribution of biodiversity hotspots in the tropics and the places where we find the most information. How do we start to tip the balance? Ecotourism might help. There's other things that might help, but what are we doing to try and tip the scales in our own favor so that we have more data, more curated data to try and ask these difficult questions?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and if you guys have insights as well, that would be great. But my perspective is that those, of course, with time, when with those systems in place, the tendency is for us to accumulate a lot more, and that will help to some extent because you can always downsample things that you have a lot of information from, and I think there was some element of like these things emerging in a certain context in the U.S. or like in the global north, as you just say, and then slowly spreading. So these observations will naturally start coming from other places as well. But I think we also need to think of it in terms of that we need to have models that deal with that. So models that, because those, as much as we want, at some, there won't be fixing all of it. So I think our models need to be able to deal with that kind of distribution. And that's definitely not the way a lot of foundational models work nowadays. So like, for example, for image classification, imbalance in the training set can be quite consequential. So also exploring the family of models that are more appropriate to deal with that. And there's definitely things like models that deal with person re-identification, which suffers from the same problems, because like sometimes if you're trying to re-identify a person, you may have only one picture of that person, right? Like, so how do you identify whose person it is? So there's definitely like other tool sets available, and hopefully we'll start incorporating them more and more into the kind of biological research.
Yeah, I have very little to add to that answer, but I'll just mention that part of this will be really thinking about this humans in the loop kind of perspective, where the models can inform how sampling might occur, and we can actually push and ask for people to fill the gaps. So if we know there's a gap, maybe the answer is to basically figure out incentive models for people to help us close them, and really think about this as a loop that can be built. I like the answer about models. I think it's interesting because like you can maybe close the gaps going forward, but there's always this challenge of the historical data being sparse. And so like I think the challenges are numerous, but spatial-temporal sort of machine learning based or AI based models I think can help us, because we've had really difficult times fitting these sort of complex spatial-temporal autoregressive models that try to like effectively fill these gaps. But a lot of those models are really hard to parameterize and fit. I think spatial-temporal AI-based approaches actually offer some unique opportunities for us to sort of close those gaps in a modeling-based framework. And then once we have the models, we can ask if they're right or wrong. We can actually collect new data, or even go back and like prioritize where we're going to sample data to figure out where our estimates are most uncertain, and determine if new data can help to like kind of make the models better, faster. That's the world I see. We don't leave here until there's a question from you guys. So we're gonna like.
Yeah, they're gonna stay until you ask questions. Yeah.
I might start crying, which no one wants to see.
Thanks.
Just a quick one. I'm curious if you guys use any like multimodal approaches or like incorporate things like remote sensing into trying to do the global outlook of looking at societies and things like that.
So that's the basis of that reverse image search thing we're doing, like with the multimodal capabilities of GPT-4, which are like a week and a half, 2 weeks old. And before that, we're using what was at the time state-of-the-art multimodal machine learning tools that like do not hold a candle to what GPT-4 can do. It was very easy to get like those models to hallucinate. So you ask it a question about an image, and maybe by the second or third response, it forgets what the image is and just starts telling you whatever you thinks you want to hear. GPT-4, it's able to like, we give it, say, 4 different images with scale bars and labels on them, and it organizes its response with the specimen IDs. It estimates how large it is. It is really good. We tried asking it today if it could guess the shape of a vessel of pottery that a fragment came of based on the quality of light and how it reflected on the 2D image. Did a pretty good job. So I'm really excited about the potential for multimodal machine learning going forward. I would like it to be more open source so that we don't have to wait for these tools to become available. We can understand how they actually work. But I think that's really where a lot of this work is going to go for working with museum collections. As for remotely sensed data, that is a whole other story, but that is really powerful, especially for looking at places like archaeological sites in the past and how they have influenced the current environment today. So just this last week, there's a paper out estimating there's like 100,000 undiscovered mounds in the Amazon rainforest. And if you like look at the tree species around those mounds, they're like totally unique, created by humans over thousands of years. So that's still happening as we speak.
I'll just mention, like, among the many things I love about where we are today, there is literally a NASA program focused on space archaeology, which basically is leveraging LiDAR and other remote sense tools. We'll have, global LiDAR, and we'll have hyperspectral imagery in 2028 for the globe. And I expect it to be transformational and allowing us to kind of look at these temporal and patterns of occupation over time. And there's a huge set of opportunities, and we use remote sensing all the time in biodiversity science, of course. And the challenge is really deriving insight from these images, right? So that's an area where I think we'll see a lot. We'll see it, obviously have seen, and we'll continue to see a ton of effort.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hey, so this weekend at the AI Hackathon, our team developed an image classifier for butterflies using the catalog from the Florida Museum. Our project was called Butterfly AI. We only had like 10 minutes in the butterfly rainforest to try it out. It was like 85% accurate. Maybe you have any suggestions for how we can make a better image classifier for butterflies or get this in the Florida Museum as an educational activity?
Well, I can at least say that this is something that we have been talking about like 4 weeks ago. So we'd be very interested in hearing more about your work on that. I think the big issue is what Arthur talked about with the sparse sampling, that some types of butterfly are very well represented in those image collections and some aren't at all. And even we have a model that works well like in the places that we can go with a phone and test it. How can we confirm it's going to work for field researchers in the Amazon? And so something I think Arthur knows more than I is how can we work in like phylogenetic information? So not just looking at individual species level, but the relationship between species and families in order to share information between varieties that we may know a lot about and those that we haven't encountered yet.
You're also lucky that that's one of the largest biodiversity collections of butterflies and moths in the world, maybe the largest now. So you're in a good place to do that. Any other questions?
I have one comment, though.
Yeah.
We should talk afterwards. Like, it's great to see people taking on these challenges, and that's just what we want to see out of this event, right, is all this synergy, which I think is amazing.
So one thing I liked about your presentation today, and we didn't necessarily see this in any of the other presentations, although it could certainly be going on, you're really attacking this problem, all facets of this problem, utilizing AI in multiple stages, everything from taking dark data that you don't have access to in pinned specimens to digitize those data, and then all the way through, studying whether it's, disease outbreak and how that changes with climate change and how past events might affect future events and so forth. It's really remarkable to see AI applied through this entire continuum of biodiversity and cultural diversity research. Let's have a round of applause for the panel, please. Thank you. So just a reminder, we have wine and cheese and posters next door. Actually, the wine won't start until 5 because that's our rule at the University of Florida, unfortunately, unless you can sweet talk the people who are selling the wine or giving away the wine. But the posters are next door, and they're really incredible. I hope you stop by. Thank you.